now and then wait.
I think we'll
It's
formally begin.
Okay.
Right.
okay.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Nabiha, and I have the honor of being your host for today's gathering. I'm representing the Pakistani Students Association Coalition, and a little bit about the coalition. We embody the passionate dreams, ambitions, and vibrancy of Pakistani students worldwide. We are united in purpose, and our collective mission is to foster understanding, facilitate dialogue, and ultimately light the torch that will guide our future leaders and innovators. Speaking of torchbearers, it gives me immense pride to introduce a figure who has been a luminary in the truest sense of the word, Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy. A distinguished nuclear physicist, he wears multiple feathers in his illustrious cap. Educated at the prestigious Massachusetts Institute of Technology, abbreviated as MIT, Dr. Hoodbhoy is not only revered for his significant contributions to the world of science, but also for his deep engagement with education and public discourse. His books, articles, and lectures have reached the corners of the globe, challenging minds, stimulating thought, and urging us all towards a more informed and rational worldview. But Dr. Hoodboy's impact isn't just limited to the scientific realms. He is a staunch advocate for reason and evidence based understanding, which the world in general, but Pakistan in specific, is in dire need of. He's pushing the boundaries of conventional thought and encouraging a generation to think critically, ask questions, and seek knowledge. Today, our dialogue centers around his seminal work, Pakistan, Origins, Identity, and Future. This book is a culmination of his profound insights into the fabric of our nation, weaving together its rich history, complex identity, and the challenges and promises of its future. For such a crucial dialogue, we have two eminent moderators. First, let me introduce you to Shahzeb Naeem, a proud alumnus of LUMS, and now walking the halls of Syracuse University Maxwell School, pursuing his master's in public administration. And our second guiding star is Abdullah Bhali, currently wearing multiple hats as a postbac student and instructor at Queen's College, with a rich background in political science and a particular tilt towards international law. Abdullah's insights into Pakistani politics, society, and economy are truly profound. Thank you so much, everyone, once again for being here. Shahzeb, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hoodboy. It is an honor for us to be interviewing you. I have actually had the pleasure of attending a few of your talks back in Karachi. I think it was 2016, 2017. You were having these seminars at the second floor, T2F. And I was always impressed by your understanding of our nation. And it was you who actually inspired me to question a lot of things about Pakistan that we've learned in our history books and the real history of our country. And it is going to be a very engaging session. So, Abdullah, if you can please start off with the questions. Abdullah, you
Abdullah?
are muted.
Yep, my bad. First screw up. All right. So, yeah, as someone who's been trying to understand the politics of Pakistan, understanding the societal framework, understanding how these nuances of the interaction among different communities, even within different individual communities, it's often very hard to get a understanding or clear grasp of individual societies. And this book actually broke down many of those obstacles I had trying to understand those nuances. And again, I can't thank you enough for writing that book. It was so eye-opening for me, and I'm sure it was eye-opening for many people. So let's get started. First of all, your book addresses like the multifaceted aspects of Pakistan's identity. Given the historical, the political, and socioeconomic complexities and conflicts that have often caused intense struggles within our nation, what inspires you to encapsulate all of that in one volume, like in one book, 450 pages?
First of all, I'm humbled by the introduction that you've given me. Nabihia, Shahzeb, and Abdullah, thank you all for your kind words. The question is a very good one. Why did I write this book? And why did I feel that I have to start from way back in the past? See, normally people, when they write the history of Pakistan, it's 1947, and then a little bit prior to that, so the Pakistan movement. But basically, I wanted to understand what are the roots of the two-nation theory that was the driving force behind the creation of Pakistan. And well, one could say, oh, it started with Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, and with him saying that Hindus and Muslims are two separate nations, and then go on to, then this finds reinforcement with Allama Iqbal, and its final expression with the speech of Muhammad Ali Jinnah at the Minar-e Pakistan, or where it is today, in Lahore, in 1940, where in his presidential address he says, there are two and only two nations that live on this subcontinent, Hindus and Muslims, and the two shall, they're different, they have different heroes, they eat different foods, they have different cultures, and they can never live together in peace. Okay, so that was the two-nation theory that drove the creation of Pakistan. But where did it really all start from? And here one then gets into the question of myths that drive nation states today. And to me, this was intellectually interesting because it's not only the myth of two nations that created Pakistan, but it's also, this myth is now driving Hindutva and the notion that Hindus formed a nation way back in the past, thousands of years ago. In fact, I would say not even thousands of years, but there are people who say hundreds of thousands of years, and in fact, billions and trillions of years ago. Doesn't make much sense to me, but these are myths, and myths are very powerful. They've got to be investigated. And so in writing this book, I said, hey, what if you had asked a guy living in some village 3,000 years ago, asked him the question, are you a Hindu? Would he have understood the question? And the answer is no. There was, in fact, no such thing as a unified Hindu religion, Hindu identity. People worship different gods. They had different occupations. They belonged to different castes. They were identified by their professions, by their forefathers, and most particularly by where they lived. And so, and in this book, I write about Al-Biruni, who comes to India with Mahmud Ghazni, and this is in the year 1000, so 1100 years ago or so. And he's quite bewitched by the land. He comes with an invader, but he's very determined to learn what the locals know and how they live. And so he learns Sanskrit, and he gets very immersed into Hindu culture, into the culture of India. The interesting thing is that he calls this land Al-Hind, and that's derived from Al-Sindh, and Sindh is the Sindhu Darya, it's the Indus River. And so the term Hindu is purely a geographical one. It is not a religious one. And so the myth that exists in India today of a unified Hindu identity is, well, a fairy story. In much the same way, the idea that Muslims constituted a nation way back into the past, and that the foundations of Pakistan were laid when Muhammad bin Qasim came to Sindh in 712 AD, and that he's the first Pakistani. Now look, this is really serious, A lot of people in Pakistan, I mean, kids, I don't mean the people who go who go through O levels, A levels, and go through LUMs and all that, or IBA or whatever. But you ask a kid who was the first Pakistani and say Muhammad bin Qasim, and wow, what a travesty of truth that is. Here is an invader who comes for booty, basically, and this is, remember that the Holy Prophet died in 638 and he comes in 712, and that's just, something like 70, 80 years, not more than that. And he comes with this specific purpose. He's been sent as a general to conquer. And of course, conquest in those days still is all about loot and plunder. And he just stays there for 2 years and goes back and is executed by his boss for various reasons. Anyway, the way that Islam eventually came to India was not through Muhammad bin Qasim. It was through a long period. They were Afghans, they were Iranians, they were Central Asians, they were Turks who brought Islam. I mean, they came as invaders, but they settled down and they created the greatest empire that India had known, and that is the Mughal Empire, which joined together different parts of India and gave it a system of administration. And so that is how Islam came to India. But then, even at the time of the Mughals, and that's, just so recent, it's just 500, 600 years ago. If you had asked a Muslim over there, he would have identified himself by his caste, because there were castes among Muslims then, and there are castes among Muslims now, Arai, Jat, Bhutto, etc., all over. And he wouldn't have had an identity except that of his class, his profession, where he lived, his language, etc. So it's a lot more complicated than is presented in our books. And you ask me why I wrote the book. It was to disentangle these complications and see how the evolution of the difference between Hindus and Muslims, because after all, they're not identical. I mean, the Muslims are enormous, the Hindus are enormously diverse amongst themselves. It's not a faith. And the differences between Muslims are huge as well, though not as much as in Hinduism. Nevertheless, how comes it that when 1947 comes along, they say we can't live with each other? Big theoretical question, which I felt had to be discussed, uncovered. Sorry I took so long.
Not at all. That was actually very interesting because it brings up some things I was pondering while I was reading the book. One of them being this hearkening to an imaginary past. And the interesting thing is, it doesn't necessarily have to be from a society that is ignorant, the way the subcontinent was under British rule. An example being Japan after the Meiji Restoration. The growth of militarism happened long after Japan had committed towards advancing its own society, and even led to it creating an empire which engaged in such barbarity that the entire region is still reeling about it. China still has never forgiven Japan for what they did. And so it is intriguing to see how the way society was the societal trajectory was headed when the colonization period began. We saw the potential for a proto-industrialization in some segments of the subcontinent. Many of them were Muslim societies. An example is Bengal. And so you start seeing something unique occur among the various communities in India none of them were the same. And so, yes, that adds to the question of where exactly did we get this idea that religion is what separated us? Why is that
Yeah,
one?
you're spot on. It's the Chinese were not a militant people, but and nor were the Japanese, and nor were the Hindus. But it's when modern technology, when they absorbed modern Western technology, then they suddenly grew muscles. And today you see them exercising those muscles all over the globe. Well, the Japanese have faded out after World War II, of course, after that enormous defeat. But the Meiji Restoration, the whole idea of militarization of Japan, you're absolutely right. That then transformed the nature of that society there. And it was all built upon myths that went way back into the past. Today, what we are seeing in India is the peaceful Hindu, the contemplative Hindu, now being turned into the militant Hindu. And it's the power of the myth that's causing this transformation. That's why myths have to be looked at in great detail. And see, all myths are not untrue. There's always a bit of truth in every myth, unless it's a total fairy story. I mean, the gods living on Mount Olympus, those are myths and those are fairy stories. But usually myths have a core of truth to them. And there's therefore the very strong intellectual question of how to locate that core and see if it's there at all.
Exactly, Professor. This made me think about Iqbal Ahmed. So he had this quote in which he basically said, all sorts of historical truths and untruths are mixed, and you organize collective emotion on the basis of difference. And that is what we currently see that is happening in Pakistan, India, other countries that are part of the subcontinent. So moving on, Dr. Hoodbhoy, we wanted to ask you the origin and identity of Pakistan. How do we reconcile the existence of Pakistan with regards to its religious identity? Clearly, the two nation theory as an option. Were there alternatives that could have existed? Since, as you've already mentioned, two communities, all types of communities were living in the subcontinent, coexisting with each other for hundreds and hundreds of years. So, what I struggled as a student was, why did the leadership of India, both Muslim, Hindu, Sikhs, other minorities, fail to ensure that all these communities could coexist? Was this exacerbated by the British? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So we know that towards the tail end of the Mughal Empire, the British were pretty much in control. I mean, they had been in control not, I'd say, decades before 1857, which was the formal end of the Mughal Empire, and Bahadur Shah Zafar was the outgoing Mughal Empire. But the differences, which had been small, became larger because of sociological reasons. Now, the Muslims as rulers were largely interested in matters of running their lands, of gathering tithe from the peasants, in hunting, in sports, in music, in art. But they left all their accounting and all business deals to Hindus, and so that became that then meant that the ways in which the Hindus and Muslims started living began to diverge. Both of them had traditional educational systems. The madrasas remained true to what had been taught 1100 years earlier, but the pachalas, the equivalent of the madrasas among Hindus, they did emphasize commerce and doing simple business accounting and learning grammar and things that would be useful for the present life. Now, the British, you remember, were only 50,000 at the very most, and they needed locals to help them support the administration. And so they realized that for this they needed education, which meant that they would like to build schools. And so 1835, Macaulay comes along with his educational reforms and says that henceforth, the British East India Company will support only those schools where they teach English and science and modern subjects, geography and so forth. They will not support the pathshalas and the madrasas, the traditional vehicles of education in India. And the reaction of the two countries, of the two communities, was entirely different. The Hindus were reluctant at the beginning, but they had been sufficiently worked upon by reformists like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and others. And they said, okay, give us schools, make more colleges, make more universities. And in fact, the first university in India was the University of Calcutta, 1856, I think. But the Muslims said, we don't want your schools, because we have our book, the Quran. It's revealed, it's got all wisdom in it. And so thank you very much, but we don't need your money. We don't need to learn English. We don't need to learn science. And in fact, more than 8,000 ulema in Bengal signed a petition against these educational reforms. So now the differences started to grow. And if you look at my book, you'll see that there are tables and tables of how many Hindus qualified as engineers, as technicians, as doctors, as lawyers, and so forth, compared to Muslims. Now, the University of Calcutta, when the first graduation took place, there were hundreds of Hindus, but just 2 or 3 Muslims. And so over time, what was a crack became a chasm. And this is the time when Sir Syed Ahmad Khan comes in, and this book over here has a full chapter on Sir Syed, which researching which I found myself much enlightened. But Sir Syed was just one person, and he's known in Pakistan just because he created that idea of Muslims and nations being two separate nations. But as we go along with time, we see the differences becoming enormous. And so the thought started to grow among the Muslim elite that, hey, we will not be able to survive once the British leave India. For one thing, the Hindus are too many. But for another, how will we compete with them in matters of education? And the modern age had come along by now. In the modern age, your value in society is determined by how much you know. And so this, I think, was perhaps the key factor which drove Allama Iqbal, later Muhammad Ali Jinnah, to insist on splitting the subcontinent. Now, I think it was a bad idea to do it on these grounds because, the Hindus separated. India is doing pretty well in science, technology, education, and you know that so many of your professors are Indian, are Hindu Indian, very few Muslim Indians, and there are almost no Pakistani professors, at least not in physics, math, engineering, maybe a few in social sciences, but not in the other disciplines. And the hope that Muslims would prosper if they separated and they didn't have competition has, I think, proved to be fatally wrong.
Yes, that's an interesting point you bring up, especially with whether or not the separation was right. What I learned from reading the part that hello. Yeah, sorry about that. What was intriguing was that it brought up the idea, or it portrayed the situation in such a way that it seems that Muslim personalities and organizations were all competing for power. And it seems that the Muslim League simply won out. By whatever methods, by politicking, it seems that they won out. But is that necessarily a wrong thing? That's something that I find interesting, because there have been many societies, many empires in South Asia that have been formed over many, many centuries. And even when those empires existed, there were still peripheral countries, peripheral states, kingdoms that existed that resisted orbiting the center, whether it was the Mauryan Empire and the Tamil kings, or the Gupta Empire and the Vijayanagars, or was it whether it was the Delhi Sultanate and the Deccan, or Aurangzeb's campaign against the Marathas, or even today, the constant standoffs of Nepal, Bhutan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka in trying to avoid being client states of India. Is it necessarily something to view as something wrong? Perhaps not. Perhaps it's not something to build a national identity on. As we've seen, calling yourself not Indian is not going to help. We're Indians, but not the Republic of Indians. Okay. So then we have to think about things that do naturally bridge us together, and that is a interesting concept. I once watched a interview General Asad Durrani had, where he described, and one aspect of Pakistan I wrote it off as something not significant, but looking back now, it might be interesting to ponder. Pakistan is a frontier region where many empires have come through. You mentioned Al-Biruni came through, Alexander came through it, Porus fought him in that land. Ranjit Singh marched in this land to kick out the Duranis. The Bajirao, the Peshwa, the minister of the Maratha Empire, also waged his campaigns here. Many Delhi Sultanate rulers, the Mughals, came through here. And through it, we have seen the development of clans and tribes that have developed a toughness that has carried down, I believe, to the modern day. I believe that's the primary reason why Pakistan is not like Somalia, where the absence of a government does not prevent the society from still working. That's something Asad Durrani also pointed out. And I believe it's interesting because it's something we hold in common, even though it's the thing that also wedges a lot of Pakistanis apart. Often you see the Pashtuns nationalists and the Baloch nationalists at odds with each other. Sindhi nationalists obviously can't do anything about that because of the status of Sindh right now, but Punjabi nationalists are now coming up again, and they're becoming exactly the same sort of tough, rugged sort of personality that you typically saw in this land. What do you think about these sorts of commonalities? Are they something to build off of, or if there's something that doesn't help at all?
It doesn't help at all. I don't think that there's such a thing as a frontier state. Oh my goodness, frontier for what? We are the center of the earth, of the universe. Everyone is the center of the universe. We're not at the peripheries of some empire. I mean, why should we care about what the British thought about us or the Americans thought about us? Yeah, sure, we were a frontline state in containing the Soviet Union, but well, that's America's perception of it. People here on the subcontinent have been living for thousands of years. And to them, their world is all that matters. Now, there was nothing natural about Pakistan. Look at the partition of Punjab. That's where all the blood came from. Most of the blood came from. Splitting Punjab, was a crime. It was a region of South Asia that had an identity. They spoke the same language. They intermingled with each other for centuries. They had common traditions. And then comes the idea of splitting it in two as per what the British wanted. Or look at what happened with the Durand Line and Afghanistan. Today, should one accept the Durand Line? Well, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan says no, and they have a point. They say this was made by some old whiskey-drinking Britisher. It's not mandated in Islam. We don't accept it. And so everything may be wrong with the TTP, but this is a point that they have. That is a valid point they have. Pakistan. So if you ask me what could have been a way of dealing with the British exit, we could have had a confederation of states, maybe 10, maybe 15, maybe 20, whatever, without a central authority that would dictate everything. Well, a certain amount of central authority is always fine. I mean, in common currency, you could have had a kind of a European Union of states at the time that the British left. Why demand the transfer of populations, people who have lived on that land for centuries, now being forced to move out? That, I think, was the tragedy of partition.
Thank you for talking about all of these issues, Dr. Hoodbhoy. If we just come back again to the trauma that subcontinent experienced during partition, as Pakistanis growing up in our history books, it was scarcely mentioned about the violence that was committed on both ends. We are scarcely taught what happened to women, the violence committed on women during partition. It is incomprehensible what happened. And then we also witnessed the partition of East and West Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh. And again, in our history books, scarcely it is talked about the loss that we faced, even though, from my understanding, Bengalis were at the forefront of the independence movement. And then it was super tragic that a separate nation had to be created, which makes us question the religious identity of Pakistan. So, what advice would you have for the youth to reconcile this identity, and how can we move forward from this collective trauma that we never talk about in open spaces in Pakistan?
Well, as the last chapter of my book is, dump the two-nation theory. I don't know exactly the words that I used over there, but the idea that Pakistan needs a religious identity now has to be trashed, which doesn't mean that we don't remain Muslims. Of course, we remain Muslims, or at least the 98% here, 95% here should remain Muslim if they want. But our identity now is to be accepted as de facto. We exist for good reason or bad. And if you look at any country in the world, it came into existence by trampling over the rights of others, or in some accidental way. I mean, look at the United States. There were native Indians living over there, and they had to be practically exterminated. And yet, because of that guilt, you can't say, let's cancel India, let's cancel the United States. You could say that about practically every region in the world, because after all, humans, when The humans had to exterminate the Neanderthals and so forth. But now that we've reached a higher stage of biological development, and we've learned ideas of empathy, of justice, and so forth, then it is possible that whatever the boundaries are, good or bad, we learn to function as decent human beings within that. So if you were born, or I was born in Israel, and born a Jew in Israel, would we be driven by our consciences to say, destroy Israel and revert to Palestine? Probably not. Israel exists for good or for worse, and so have to accept it. Pakistan exists for good or for bad. It came into existence for a bad reason. That bad reason was that Hindus and Muslims cannot live together. It's a false reason, because they can. They live together in different parts of the world. Take Malaysia, take Indonesia. They live together reasonably well. Muslims in India live with Hindus. Yes, there's conflict. And that conflict has been made much sharper because of the rise of Hindu nationalism. But it's not genocide over there by any means. In fact, the population of Muslims is increasing relative to Hindus. So the point is that one shouldn't worry too much about where and how a country came into existence and what an individual's particularly identity is. In a broader perspective, we're all humans endowed with the same innate qualities and subjected now to increasingly similar influences upon us because we live in the age of the internet, of instant communications. And so we're becoming more and more similar. You and I, the Chinese and the Japanese and the Americans and the Swedes and everybody.
That's interesting. I want to actually touch on that. You mentioned that the social media generation would actually be a boon for Pakistan in one way, and that is that it would help form an identity. And you mentioned in the book that you're seeing that parts of a national unifying identity and culture appear. Could you expand on that? What aspects do you see that are appearing that are uniting Pakistanis?
Well, I recently went to Gwadar, spent a few days over there, earlier to Quetta. Then I went last month to Abbottabad. I went to Gilgit, and everywhere that I go, it's pretty much that I can speak to them in Urdu. I don't know Balochi. My Sindhi is so-so. My Urdu is okay. My Punjabi is pretty primitive. But everywhere I went, I could communicate well enough in Urdu. And people didn't look as if they descended from Mars. They had similar complaints. Everyone in Pakistan, from Punjab to Gwadar to Peshawar, they complain about corruption, how lousy the rulers are, how much untruth is told on television, etc. And that's a commonality. Maybe it's not a very good commonality, but the very fact that we can talk to each other. And so if we're only, marginally decent to each other, I think Pakistan can continue to exist. It won't fall apart. As it is, I don't think its geographical borders are going to be changed, are possible to change in a hurry because India cannot take over Pakistan. It does not have the military strength, and most importantly, the nuclear weapons that virtually guarantee that there will be no war between India and Pakistan. Or, of course, if that happens, then neither country survives it. So I think there are elements of a Pakistani identity that are being formed. Now, counter to that, I would say that there is a lot of resentment at how Punjab handles the other provinces. When I went to Gilgit, this is just 2 weeks ago, everywhere you see the FC, the Frontier Corps, you see the army, and you see that they are Punjabi. They're not from Gilgit-Baltistan, and they're in all the important places, and they make sure that they're a nuisance. Like they'll put up checkposts and they'll demand identification papers from you. Although Gilgit-Baltistan is just about the most peaceful place that there is in Pakistan. So why do they need to do that? Anyway, so moving away from that, I do believe a Pakistani identity will emerge unless we screw up things too badly.
Well, that's more likely to happen than not if we're being pessimistic. But that actually segues into something interesting, because when it comes to the issue of forming an identity, naturally will have to be a multi-ethnic, inclusive one, right?
Correct.
What kind of what ideas do you think would be, let me phrase this a little better. What should the role of Pakistan's government and its social institutions be in either facilitating or otherwise interacting with those different cultures?
Oh, I don't think that's a very hard question to answer. First of all, give Pakistan's various regional languages a place of respect. You see now that Urdu is imposed upon everyone. And now, in addition to that, Arabic. And nobody knows Arabic over here. So they have to send magistrates and policemen with dandas to go and make sure that the Arabic is taught properly. It's ridiculous. So if we want regional integration, we have to build upon the 18th Amendment, which gave each of the provinces a greater share of the national wealth and control over how they could spend their local funds. But we need to devolve this down even further. Then we have to let the devolution extend into education in a meaningful way. And so allow people to give at least the middle school exams in the language of their choice. More importantly, or I'd say just as importantly, not more importantly, I'd say that the bureaucracy and the military, there has to be far much more representation of the provinces than at the present time. Also, we might need more provinces. In fact, this is a suggestion that's been made again and again, that to have 4 provinces, so it's KPK, Punjab, Balochistan, Sindh. Gilgit-Baltistan as yet, although it's been in the works for a long time, is not yet a province. Now, why do we need just 4 or 5 provinces? Each of those provinces, or at least let's take Punjab. Punjab is what, something like over 100 million people now. 100 million people, so compare that with Israel. Israel has 9 million people or 10 million people. That's 10 times the size of Israel. And what's it got? 1 chief minister. That's not a good way of running a huge province like that. Or take Karachi. Karachi is now 25 million people, and that's 2.5 Israels, something like that. Why should we not have finer and finer divisions to encompass the fact that administration today is a much more complex task than earlier? This devolution of power will, I think, profoundly improve nation building in Pakistan. Well, of course, there are other things too, like, give women the right to jobs, the right to vote in places where it's in effect denied, like in most of the tribal areas of Pakistan, and allow them to be without burqa if they don't want it.
Thank you, Dr. Hoodbhoy. With regards to the devolution of power and keeping in mind that we are almost, I think 10 minutes are left for the session, so we should also move forward and ask the audience if they have any questions. But one last question that I had was just understanding the elephant in the room, which is basically the influence and role played by the military establishment. And there are a lot of theories and studies that Pakistani democracy has never truly flourished because of interventions by the military. What is your opinion on that? And how do you see this tension between military bureaucracy and the civilians in truly making Pakistan representative of its diverse ethnic, linguistic, and different cultural groups that exist?
Well, the military's been in charge of Pakistan from almost the very beginning. And I think it was pretty clear why that happened, because the Muslim League had mostly landlords and feudals and just a handful of people who were articulate and literate, and people like Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Liaquat Ali Khan and so forth. But the rest were just feudals, big landlords with no interest in anything except grabbing more power and exercising total tyranny over those they rule. And so when Jinnah died, within 2 years after that, the Muslim League effectively fell apart. So which was the major organized modern power, disciplined power? It was the Pakistan Army. And then the Pakistan Army has essentially ruled Pakistan from 1958 onwards. And today you can see that they're everywhere. They're into business. I don't know of any other army that runs airlines, banks, fertilizers, sugar, cement, even beauty parlors, ice cream. So you can, and of course, the real estate business is controlled by the army as well. And if you go to Gwadar, you'll see just the extent of the land that they've grabbed for their colonies over there, which one day they will turn over into highly lucrative real estate. Ditto for Abbottabad, ditto for Gilgit, everywhere that you see. So I don't think they're going to go away in a hurry. A war with India would certainly result in their defeat, but there can't be a war because we have nukes, and nukes have essentially put them in a position of permanence, unless, of course, Pakistan goes totally bankrupt. Because we do have to bear in mind that we have a $20 billion shortfall every year for which we take more and more loans, and that with the passage of time, that's become harder and harder, especially because our geopolitical importance has dwindled to near zero. Now, There's no Soviet Union walking into Afghanistan, and the US doesn't care about Afghanistan anymore. China is very pragmatic. They give us no aid, they give us loans, and then they expect the interest on the loans to be paid back pronto. So, if a collapse comes, it'll be an economic collapse. Maybe we'll be able to take some things back from the army, but I don't know.
All right. If there are no other questions, then I guess first of all, thank you for that discussion. That was very illuminating. That was definitely something. There were things that I never really considered before, and some things that you wrote in the book that I am glad I could get a little more commentary on, because it helps me understand not only your position on this, but it helps me clarify my own understanding of what this is. And I hope that everyone else in the audience, everyone listening, has also been able to gain profoundly from this. And unless there are any other topics we wish to discuss, I think we could possibly open it up to the audience questions. Nabiha, Shazeb, are you fine with that?
Yes, I was just going to ask Nabiha, it's like there are a bunch of questions that the audience has asked. So if Nabiha can take the lead.
Of course, thank you so much, Dr. Hoodbhoy. This was definitely something that I was really excited for, and the excitement really lived through. Thank you so much for this amazing session. Being selfish, I would actually like to ask one of the questions that I was thinking about. You mentioned that there's the further division of the provinces that is possible, and that's the potential, solution to moving forward in a prosperous manner for Pakistan. Seeing as the fact that division of power is really well received, looking at our history, looking at other countries as well, do you think that the Pakistani leaders or politicians of today will allow for one this peaceful, disintegration of power? And the second part of the question is, do you think that once this power is divided and new key players are introduced, Pakistan has that tolerance to cooperate, given that the system becomes more complex as new individuals enter the picture?
Well, given that a Seraiki province has not yet emerged, and given that Gilgit-Baltistan's emergence as a province is yet to be decided upon. I mean, the National Assembly did vote on that, but somehow it has not been implemented. And so the powers up above are very wary of devolving power downwards. So if you ask me, will it happen? I don't see it happening unless something else happens, because sometimes a state of breakdown then forces things that would otherwise not happen to happen. So let's put it in that category. How many provinces should there be? Well, let's not call them provinces, let's call them administrative units. Somebody I remember wrote, and I've quoted him in my book, said there should be 123. So I thought it was a rather odd number, but that's in fact the number of districts. And so if one can somehow break this oligarchy of power, then I think Pakistan could become a truly democratic state. Because when you see people in your immediate neighborhood who are actually the people in power, then it makes sense to approach them. It makes sense then for them to be sincere in fulfilling their promises. Right now, it's a very strange situation. None of the parties, PMLN, People's Party, JUIF, or PTI, none of them has an election manifesto. They don't say
Right.
what they're going to do.
Right. I think that answers it well. Thank you. Another theme that I see within the questions concerns the future challenges that Pakistan has faced. So I think Ari put it really well when he asked, how would you say does Pakistan's journey of identity and nationhood compare to that of other post-colonial nations? And are there any unique challenges that Pakistan has faced that sets it apart?
Yes, well, let's look in our neighborhood. India is much more diverse than Pakistan is. And yet, there's a strong sense of Indian nationalism. In fact, too strong for my liking. But yeah, it's there. How did that come to be? It came because people had a voice. They could participate not just in elections, but in actually influencing what their politicians do. And of course, there are tricks that nation states play to generate identity. You have to be against somebody else, so they're against China and Pakistan. All those tricks are, of course, there. But the fact is that democracy could be sustained for such a long period, and that India was not run by its army, I think helped consolidate its identity. I'd say pretty much the same thing about Bangladesh. Bangladesh started out as East Pakistan with an Islamic identity, but then it no longer calls itself an Islamic state, an Islamic republic. It is built instead on the unity of Bengali culture. And of course, there's no problem of language over there. So Bangladesh can fix its national goals. Its goals are the prosperity of its people, to compete in the international market, to deal with challenges as they come. And of course, climate change is going to be a huge problem for Bangladesh.
Right. That makes sense. And Dr. Hoodbhoy, I know that we are at time, but I'd really appreciate if I could just ask one final question. Could I take permission for that?
Sure.
Thank you so much. So one other thing that I see, which is a really good concluding segue too, is what do you see as the biggest potential catalyst for change in Pakistan's identity and future direction in the coming years? And then if you could also supplement that by what overseas Pakistanis can do to help drive the change that you're proposing. What's their contribution essentially?
Well, I think overseas Pakistanis, first of all, need to regard themselves as global citizens, but with their roots in Pakistan to an extent. Look, when we are global citizens, we don't really care about roots. We care about where we are situated, and we behave accordingly. In terms of what they can do for Pakistan, well, just keep demanding honesty, change, freedom from corruption, power to the people, not to the army, and above all else, I'd say, insist that education in Pakistan change and become like that in the rest of the world. That is to say, it gives the people of Pakistan skills, knowledge, and the means by which they can compete with other countries in the world, so that they don't have to be so desperate as to want to leave the country, sit in boats, get drowned, and so forth. So look, all of us play very minor roles. You, me. This is a historical process that'll go whichever way it will. All you and I can do is help give a little push in the direction that we think is the right one.
That makes sense. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoodbhoy, for the insightful conversation that we had today. I personally learned a lot, and I'm pretty sure that this was very beneficial for viewers too. We really appreciate you taking out the time. I will sit and ponder over everything that I've heard today. It's very new for me, especially as an undergrad student myself. I've always wanted to question, the claims that we see in our Pakistan history book. But unfortunately, I've never really had the chance to be an active participant in such a discussion. Thank you so much for,
Well,
honoring our
thank you.
request and participation.
Thank you very much. I think, and I thank you for all the intelligent questions that were asked. They went to the point, and I hope we'll get to see each other again at some point. Thank you.
Inshallah, I hope so too. Thank you so much to our moderators as well, Abdullah and Shazay. Both of you did a wonderful job. This was our very first session. So we're in the learning process too, and we look forward to how, you guys help shape PSA's future collaborations as well. So once again, thank you so much everyone for your participation, Dr. Hoodbhoy, for attending, for giving us all this insightful opinions that we will definitely carry out with ourselves, and that will shape the perception of us, the youth of Pakistan. I really hope that this is beneficial for all. Thank you so much, Areeb, for and the rest of the team for arranging this session for us. And with that, I believe we're at time. So I would not like to, keep any of you over time. So Jazakallah khair, everyone. Take care of yourselves. Hoping to see you in the next session.
Bye.